Letter 6, dated at Monreal, June 20, 1684. Being an ample description of the Canows made of birch-bark, in which the Canadans perform all their voyages, with an account of the manner in which they are made and managed. Sir, I thought to have set out this day, but in regard that our complement of great canoes is not yet brought up, our voyage is put off for 2 days. Having so much leisure time upon my hands, I have a mind to employ it in presenting you with a short view of these slender contrivances, in which the Canadans perform all their voyages, and this will furnish you with an idea of the voiture of this country. I saw but now above 100 canoes, some great and some little, but considering that the former are only proper for martial expeditions and long voyages, I shall confine my description to that sort. Even the great ones are of different sizes, for they run from 10 to 28 foot long. Indeed, the least of all hold but 2 persons set upon their breech, as in a coffin, and are apt to overset if the passengers move to one side or the other. But those of a larger size will easily afford stowage for 14 persons, though they are commonly manned only with 3 men when they are employed in transporting provisions and merchandise, and even then they'll carry 20 hundredweight. The largest sort are safe and steady when they are made of the bark of the birch tree, which comes off with hot water in the winter time. The greatest trees afford the best barks for canoes, but oftentimes the bark of one tree is not sufficient. The bottom of the boat is all of one piece, to which the sides are so artfully sewed by the savages that the whole boat appears as one continued bark. They are trimmed and strengthened with wicker wreaths and ribs of cedar wood, which are almost as light as cork. The wreaths are as thick as a crown piece, but the bark has the thickness of 2 crowns, and the ribs are as thick as 3. On the 2 sides of the boat, there runs from one end to the other 2 principal head bars, in which the ends of the ribs are encased, and in which the spars are made fast that run across the boat and keep it compact. These boats have 20 inches in depth, that is, from the upper edge to the platform of the ribs. Their length extends to 28 foot, and the width of the middle rib is computed to be 4 foot and a half. They are very convenient upon the account of their extreme lightness and the drawing of very little water, but at the same time their brittle and tender fabric is an argument of an equivalent inconveniency. For if they do but touch or grate upon stone or sand, the cracks of the bark fly open, upon which the water gets in and spoils the provisions and merchandise. Every day there is some new chink or seam to be gummed over. At night they are always unloaded and carried on shore, where they are made fast with pegs, lest the wind should blow them away, for they are so light that 2 men carry them upon their shoulders with ease. This conveniency of lightness and easy carriage renders them very serviceable in the rivers of Canada, which are full of cataracts, waterfalls, and currents. For in these rivers we are obliged either to transport them over land where such obstructions happen, or else to tow them along where the current is not over rapid and the shore is accessible. These boats are of no use for the navigation of lakes, for the waves would swallow them up if they could not reach the shore when a wind arises. 'Tis true the inhabitants venture in them for 4 or 5 leagues from one island to another, but then 'tis always in calm weather, and nothing is made use of but oars, for besides the risk of being overset, the goods are in danger of being damaged by the water, especially the furs, which are the most valuable part of the cargo. When the season serves, they carry little sails, But if the wind be but a little brisk, though they run right afore it, 'tis impossible to make any use of it without running the risk of shipwreck. If their course lies directly south, they cannot put up sail without the wind stands at one of the 8 points, between northwest and northeast, and if a wind happens to spring anywhere else, unless it comes from the land which they coast along, they are obliged to put in to the shore with all possible expedition, and unload the boat out of hand, till such time as a calm returns. As for the working of these boats, the canoe men ply sometimes on their knees, namely when they run down the small waterfalls, sometimes standing, when they stem a current by setting the boat along with poles, and sometimes sitting, viz., in smooth and stagnating water. The oars they make use of are made of maple wood, and their form is represented in the annexed cut. The blade of the oar is 20 inches long, 6 inches broad, and 4 lines thick. The handle is about 3 foot long and as big as a pigeon's egg. When they have occasion to run up against rapid currents, they make use of poles made of pine wood, and the setting of the boat along with these is what they call piquet de fond. The canoes have neither stern nor prow, for they run to a point at both ends. Neither have they keels, nails, or pegs in the whole structure. The steersman, or he who conns the boat, rows without interruption as well as the rest. The common purchase of such a boat is 80 crowns, but it does not last above 5 or 6 years. This day I have received advice that Mr. de la Barre has raised the militia in the neighborhood of Quebec, and that the governor of this island has received orders to have that of the adjacent cantons in readiness to march. I am, sir, yours, etc. Letter 7. Dated at Monreal, November 2, 1684. Describing the course of the river of St. Laurence from Monreal to the first great lake of Canada, with the waterfalls, cataracts, and navigation of that river, as also Fort Frontenac and the advantages that accrue from it, together with a circumstantial account of the expedition of Mr. de la Barre, the Governor-General, against the Iroquois, the speeches he made, the replies he received, and the final accommodation of the difference. Sir, thank God I have finished this campaign, and am now returned in safety to this place, to present you with the history of our campaign. Be pleased to know that in 2 or 3 days after the date of my last, I embarked on board of a canoe that was worked by 3 expert canoemen. Every canoe contained 2 soldiers, and we all rowed up against the current of the river till we arrived at Sault de St. Louis, about 3 leagues above this town, which is a little waterfall, but so rapid that our watermen were forced to stand in the water up to their middle in order to drag the canoes against the stream for half a quarter of a league. We re-embarked above this pass and rowed about 12 leagues up the river and through the lake of St. Louis till we arrived at a place called the Cascades, where we were forced to turn out and carry our boats and baggage overland, about half a quarter of a league. 'Tis true, we might have towed our boats against the stream in this place with some labor, but there was a cataract a little above it, which they call Le Cataract du Trou. I had taken up a notion that the only difficulty of sailing up the river consisted in the trouble of land carriage, but when I came to be a spectator of the matter, I found that the stemming of the currents, whether in towing of the canoes or in setting them along with poles, was equally laborious. About 5 or 6 leagues higher, we came to the waterfalls called Saut de Cèdre and Du Buisson, where we were forced to transport our boats 500 paces overland. Some leagues above that, we entered the lake of St. Francis, which is said to be 20 leagues in circumference, and having crossed it, met with as strong currents as before, particularly at a fall called Long South, where we had recourse to land carriage for half a league. Then we were forced to drag up the boats against the rapid stream, and after a great deal of fatigue, came at last to a pass called La Galette, from whence we had but 20 leagues sailing to Fort Frontenac. This pass was the last difficulty we had to surmount, for above it the water was as still as that of a pool, and then our watermen plied with their oars instead of poles. The maringouins, which we call midges, are insufferably troublesome in all the countries of Canada. We were haunted with such clouds of them that we thought to be eat up, and smoking being the only artifice that could keep them off, the remedy was worse than the disease. In the night time, the people shelter themselves from them in bowers or arbors made after the following manner. They drive into the ground stakes or little branches of trees at a certain distance one from another, so as to form a semicircular figure in which they put a quilt and bedclothes, covering it above with a large sheet that falls down to the ground on all sides, and so hinders the insects to enter. We landed at Fort Frontenac after 20 days sailing, and immediately upon our arrival, Mr. Duta, our commander-in-chief, viewed the fortifications of the place and 3 large barks that lay at anchor in the port. We repaired the fortifications in a very little time, and fitted up the 3 barks. This fort was a square consisting of large curtains flanked with 4 little bastions. These flanks had but 2 battlements, and the walls were so low that one might easily climb upon them without a ladder. After Mr. de la Salle concluded the peace with the Iroquois, the king bestowed upon him and his heirs the property of this place, but he was so negligent that instead of enriching himself by the commerce it might have afforded, he was considerably out of pocket upon it. To my mind, this fort is situated very advantageously for a trade with the 5 Iroquois nations, for their villages lie in the neighborhood of the lake, upon which they may transport their furs in canoes with more ease than they can carry them over land to New York. In time of war, I take it to be indefensible, for the cataracts and currents of the river are such that 50 Iroquois may there stop 500 French without any other arms but stones. Do but consider, sir, that for 20 leagues together the river is so rapid that we dare not set the canoe 4 paces off the shore. Besides, Canada being nothing but a forest, as I intimated above, 'tis impossible to travel there without falling every foot into ambuscades, especially upon the banks of this river, which are lined with thick woods that render them inaccessible. None but the savages can skip from rock to rock and score through the thickets as if it were an open field. If we were capable of such adventures, we might march 500 or 600 men by land to guard the canoes that carry the provisions, but at the same time, 'tis to be considered that before they arrived at the fort, they would consume more provisions than the canoes can carry. Not to mention that the Iroquois would still outnumber them. As to the particulars relating to the fort, I shall take notice of them when I come to give a general description of New France. While we continued at Fort Frontenac, the Iroquois who live at Canows and Quinte, at the distance of 7 or 8 leagues from thence, threw in upon us harts, roebucks, turkeys, and fish, in exchange for needles, knives, powder, and ball. Towards the end of August, Mr. de la Barre joined us, but he was dangerously ill of a fever, which raged in like manner among most of his militia, so that only our 3 companies were free from sickness. This fever was of the intermitting kind, and the convulsive motions, tremblings, and frequency of the pulse that attended the cold fit were so violent that most of our sick men died in the 2nd or 3rd fit. Their blood was of a blackish-brown color, and tainted with a sort of yellowish serum, not unlike pus or corrupt matter. Mr. de la Barre's physician, who in my opinion knew as little of the true causes of fevers as Hippocrates or Galen, and 100,000 besides. This mighty physician, I say, pretending to trace the cause of the fever I now speak of, imputed it to the unfavorable qualities of the air and the aliment. His plea was that the excessive heat of the season put the vapors or exhalations into an over-rapid motion, that the air was so over-ratified that we did not suck in a sufficient quantity of it, that the small quantity we did receive was loaded with insects and impure corpusculums, which the fatal necessity of respiration obliged us to swallow, and that by this means nature was put into disorder. He added that the use of brandy and salt meat soured the blood, that this sourness occasioned a sort of coagulation of the chyle and blood, that the coagulation hindered it to circulate through the heart with a due degree of celerity, and that thereupon there ensued an extraordinary fermentation, which is nothing else but a fever. But after all, to my mind this gentleman's system was too much upon the Iroquois strain, for at that rate the distemper must have seized all without distinction, whereas neither our soldiers nor the seasoned Canadans were troubled with it, for it raged only among the militia, who being unacquainted with the way of setting the boats with poles, were forced at every turn to get into the water and drag them up against the rapid stream. Now, the waters of that country being naturally cold, and the heat being excessive, the blood might thereupon freeze by way of antiperistasis, and so occasion the fever I speak of, pursuant to the common maxim, omnis repentina mutatio est periculosa, i.e., all sudden changes are of dangerous consequence. As soon as Mr. de la Barre recovered, he embarked in order to continue his march, though he might have easily known that after halting 14 or 15 days at that fort, when the season was so far advanced, he could not pretend to compass the end of his expedition. We rode night and day, the weather being very calm, and in 5 or 6 days came before the river of Famine, where we were forced to put in upon the apprehension of a storm. Here we met with a canoe that Mr. Dolhut had sent from Missilimakinac, with advice that pursuant to orders he had engaged the Hurons, Outaouais, and some other people. This joined his army, in which he had above 200 brave forest rangers. These news were very acceptable to Mr. de la Barre, but at the same time he was very much perplexed, for unpersuaded he repented oftener than once of his entering upon an expedition that he foresaw would prove successless. And to aggravate the danger of his enterprise, the Iroquois had at the time an opportunity to fall upon us. In fine, after a mature consideration of the consequences and of the difficulties that stood in the way, he sent back the canoe to Mr. Dolhut, with orders to dismiss the forest rangers and savages immediately, wherever he was, and by all means to avoid the approaching to his troops. By good luck, Mr. Dolhut had not yet reached Niagara when he received these orders, with which the savages that accompanied him were so dissatisfied that they threw out all manner of invectives against the French nation. As soon as Mr. de la Barre had dispatched this canoe, he sent Mr. Le Moyne to the village of the Onontague, which lay about 18 leagues up the river. This Mr. Le Moyne was a gentleman of Normandy, and highly esteemed by the Iroquois, who'd call him a Cueslon, i.e. the partridge. His orders were to endeavor by all means to bring along with him some of the old standards of that nation, and accordingly he returned in a few days, accompanied with one of their most considerable grandees, who had a train of 30 young warriors, and was distinguished by the title of the Grangula. As soon as he debarked, Mr. de la Barre sent him a present of bread and wine, and of 30 salmon trouts, which they fished in that place in such plenty, that they brought up 100 at one cast of a net. At the same time, he gave the grandee to understand that he congratulated his arrival, and would be glad to have an interview with him, after he had rested himself for some days. You must know that he had used the precaution of sending the sick back to the colony, that the Iroquois might not perceive the weakness of his forces, and to favor the stratagem, Mr. Lemoyne represented to the Grangula that the body of the army was left behind at Fort Frontenac, and that the troops he saw in our camp were the general's guards. But unhappily, one of the Iroquois that had a smattering of the French tongue, having strolled in the night time towards our tents, overheard what we said, and so revealed the secret. 2 days after their arrival, the Grangula gave notice to Mr. de la Barre that he was ready for an interview, and accordingly, an hour being appointed, the whole company appeared as the figure represents it. The Grangula sat on the east side, being placed at the head of his men, with his pipe in his mouth, and the great calumet of peace before him. He was very attentive to the following harangue pronounced by our interpreters, which you cannot well understand without a previous explication of the calumet and the colliers that it mentions. The calumet of peace is made of certain stones, or of marble, whether red, black, or white. The pipe or stalk is 4 or 5 foot long. The body of the calumet is 8 inches long, and the mouth or head in which the tobacco is lodged is 3 inches in length. Its figure approaches to that of a hammer. The red calumets are most esteemed. The savages make use of them for negotiations and state affairs, and especially in voyages, for when they have a calumet in their hand, they go where they will in safety. The calumet is trimmed with yellow, white, and green feathers, and has the same effect among the savages that the flag of friendship has amongst us. For to violate the rights of this venerable pipe is among them a flaming crime that will draw down mischief upon their nations. As for the collier, they are certain swaths of 2 or 3 foot in length and 6 inches in breadth, being decked with little beads made of a certain sort of shells that they find upon the seashore, between New York and Virginia. These beads are round and as thick as a little pea, but they are twice as long as a grain of corn. Their color is either blue or white, and they are bordered through just like pearl, being run after the same manner upon strings that lie sideways one to another. Without the intervention of this collier, there's no business to be negotiated with the savages, for being altogether unacquainted with writing, they make use of them for contracts and obligations. Sometimes they keep for an age the collier that they have received from their neighbors, and in regard that every collier has its peculiar mark, they learn from the old persons the circumstances of the time and place in which they were delivered. But after that age is over, they are made use of for new treaties. Mr. de la Barre's harangue was to this purpose. The king, my master, being informed that the 5 Iroquois nations have for a long time made infractions upon the measures of peace, ordered me to come hither with a guard and to send Accrue to the canton of the Onontague, in order to an interview with their principal leaders, in the neighborhood of my camp. This great monarch means that you and I should smoke together in the great calumet of peace, with the proviso that you engage in the name of the Stonontuans, Gogoguans, Onontagues, Onoyotes, and Agnies, to make reparations to his subjects, and to be guilty of nothing for the future that may occasion a fatal rupture. The Stonontuans, Gogogwans, Onontags, Onoyotes, and Agniae have stripped, robbed, and abused all the forest rangers that traveled in the way of trade to the country of the Illines, of the Umamis, and of several other nations who are my master's children. Now this usage being in high violation of the treaties of peace concluded with my predecessor, I am commanded to demand reparation, and at the same time to declare that in case of their refusal to comply with my demands, or of relapsing into the like robberies, war is positively proclaimed. This collier makes my words good. The warriors of these 5 nations have introduced the English to the lakes, belonging to the king my master, and into the country of those nations to whom my master is a father. This they have done with a design to ruin the commerce of his subjects, and to oblige these nations to depart from their due allegiance, notwithstanding the remonstrances of the late governor of New York, who saw through the danger that both they and the English exposed themselves to. At present I am willing to forget those actions, but if ever you be guilty of the like for the future, I have express orders to declare war. This collier warrants my words. The same warriors that have made several barbarous incursions upon the country of the Illines and the Omami, they have massacred men, women, and children. They have took, bound, and carried off an infinite number of the natives of those countries, who, though themselves secure in their villages in a time of peace, these people are my master's children, and therefore must hereafter cease to be your slaves. I charge you to restore them to their liberty, and to send them home without delay, for if the 5 nations refuse to comply with this demand, I have express orders to declare war. This collier makes my words good. This is all I had to say to the Grangula, whom I desired to report to the 5 nations this declaration, that my master commanded me to make. He wishes they had not obliged him to send a potent army to the fort of Cataracts, in order to carry on a war that will prove fatal to them, and he will be very much troubled if it so falls out that this fort, which is a work of peace, must be employed for a prison to your militia. These mischiefs ought to be prevented by mutual endeavors. The French, who are the brethren and friends of the 5 nations, will never disturb their repose, provided they make the satisfaction I now demand, and prove religious observers of their treaties. I, with my words, may produce the desired effect, for if they do not, I am obliged to join the governor of New York, who has orders from the king his master to assist me to burn the 5 villages and cut you off. This collier confirms my word, while Mr. de la Barre's interpreter pronounced this harangue. The Grangula did nothing but looked upon the end of his pipe. After the speech was finished, he rose, and having took 5 or 6 turns in the ring that the French and the savages made, he returned to his place, and standing upright, spoke after the following manner to the general who sat in his chair of state. Onontio, I honor you, and all the warriors that accompany me do the same. Your interpreter has made an end of his discourse, and now I come to begin mine. My voice glides to your ear. Pray, listen to my words. Onontio, in setting out from Quebec, you must needs have fancied that the scorching beams of the sun had burned down the forests which render our country inaccessible to the French, or else that the inundations of the lake had surrounded our cottages and confined us as prisoners. This certainly was your thought, and it could be nothing else but the curiosity of seeing a burnt or drowned country that moved you to undertake a journey hither. But now you have an opportunity of being undeceived, for I and my warlike retinue come to assure you that the Tsonontuans, Gogogwans, Ononteg, Onoyotes, and Agnie are not yet destroyed. I return you thanks in their name, for bringing into their country the calumet of peace that your predecessor received from their hands. At the same time, I congratulate your happiness in having left underground the bloody axe that has been so often dyed with the blood of the French. I must tell you, Onontio, I am not asleep. My eyes are open, and the sun that watches the light gives me a clear view of a great captain at the head of a troop of soldiers who speaks as if he were asleep. He pretends that he does not approach to this lake with any other view than to smoke with the Onontag in the great calumet. But the Grangula knows better things. He sees plainly that the Onontio meaned to knock him on the head if the French arms had not been so much weakened. I perceive that the Onontio raves in a camp of sick people, whose lives the Great Spirit has saved by visiting them with infirmities. Do you hear, Onontio? Our women had took up their clubs, and the children and the old men had visited your camp with their bows and arrows, if our warlike men had not stopped and disarmed them. When Acquesen, your ambassador, appeared before my village. But I have done. I'll talk no more of that. You must know, Onontio, we have robbed no Frenchmen, but those who supplied the Illines and the Omamis, our enemies, with fuses, with powder, and with ball. These indeed we took care of, because such arms might have cost us our life. Our conduct in that point is of a piece with that of the Jesuits, who stave all the barrels of brandy that are brought to our cantons, lest the people getting drunk should knock them in the head. Our warriors have no beavers to give in exchange for all the arms they take from the French. And as for the old superannuated people, they do not think of bearing arms. This collier comprehends my word. We have conducted the English to our lakes in order to traffic with the Ottawas and the Hurons, just as the Algonquins conducted the French to our 5 cantons, in order to carry on a commerce that the English lay claim to as their right. We are born freemen, and have no dependence either upon the Onontio or the Corlar. We have a power to go where we please, to conduct who we will to the places we resort to, and to buy and sell where we think fit. If your allies are your slaves or children, you may even treat them as such and rob them of the liberty of entertaining any other nation but your own. This collier contains my word. We fell upon the Illines and the Umamis because they cut down the trees of peace that served for limits or boundaries to our frontiers. They came to hunt beavers upon our lands, and contrary to the custom of all the savages, have carried off whole stocks, both male and female. They have engaged the Choanons in their interests, and entertained them in their country. They supply them with firearms, after the concerting of ill design against us. We have done less than the English and the French, who without any right have usurped the grounds they are now possessed of, and of which they have dislodged several nations, in order to make way for their building of cities, villages, and forts. This collier contains my word. I give you to know, Onontio, that my voice is the voice of the 5 Iroquois cantons. This is their answer. Pray incline your ear and listen to what they represent. The Tsonontuans, Gogogwans, Onontags, Onoyotes, and Agnie declare that they interred the axe at Cataracts in the presence of your predecessor, in the very center of the fort, and planted the tree of peace in the same place, that it might be carefully preserved. That was then stipulated, that the fort should be used as a place of retreat for merchants, and not a refuge for soldiers, and that instead of arms and ammunition, it should be made a receptacle of only beaver skins and merchandise goods. Be it known to you, Onontio, that for the future you ought to take care that so great a number of martial men as I now see, being shut up in so small a fort, do not stifle and choke the tree of peace. Since it took root so easily, it must needs be of pernicious consequence to stop its growth, and hinder it to shade both your country and ours with its leaves. I do assure you, in the name of the 5 nations, that our warriors shall dance the calumet dance under its branches, that they shall rest in tranquility upon their mats, and will never dig up the axe to cut down the tree of peace, till such time as the Onontio and the Corlar do either jointly or separately offer to invade the country that the Great Spirit has disposed of in the favor of our ancestors. This collier contains my word, and the other comprehends the power granted to me by the 5 nations. Then the Grangula addressed himself to Mr. Lemoyne, and spoke to this purpose. Acquiescent, take heart, you are a man of sense. Speak and explain my meaning. Be sure you forget nothing, but declare all that thy brethren and thy friends represent to thy chief Onontio, by the voice of the Grangula, who pays you all honor and respect, and invites you to accept of this present of beavers, and to assist at his feast immediately. This other present of beavers is sent by the 5 nations to the Onontio. As soon as the Grangula had done, Mr. Lemoyne and the Jesuits that were present explained his answer to Mr. de la Barre, who thereupon retired to his tent, and stormed and blustered till somebody came and represented to him that Iroca progenies nesit avere modos, i.e., the Iroquois are always upon extremes. The Grangula danced after the Iroquois manner, by the way of prelude to his entertainment, after which he regaled several of the French. 2 days after, he and his martial retinue returned to their own country, and our army set out for Monreal. As soon as the general was on board, together with the few healthy men that remained, the Canows were dispersed, for the militia straggled here and there, and every one made the best of his way home. Our 3 companies indeed kept together, because all of us, both officers and soldiers, were carried in flat-bottomed boats, made of deal on purpose for our use. However, I could have wished to have run down the falls and cataracts in the same canoe that brought me up, for everybody thought we should have been cast away at these passes, which are full of eddies and rocks, and 'twas never heard before that such precipices were passed with deal boats, either upwards or downwards. But we were forced to run all hazards, and had certainly been swallowed up in those mountains of water if we had not obliged several canoes to shoot the cataracts at the head of our boats in order to show us the way. At the same time, we had prepared our soldiers for rowing and sheaving upon occasion. Do but consider, sir, that the currents run as fast as a cannonball, and that one false stroke of the oar would have run us unavoidably upon the rocks, for we are obliged to steer a zigzag course pursuant to the thread of the stream, which has 50 windings. The boats which are loaded are sometimes lost in those places, but after all, though the risk we run be very great, yet by way of compensation one has the satisfaction of running a great way in a little time. For we run from Galette to this town in 2 days' time, notwithstanding that we crossed the 2 stagnating lakes I took notice of before. As soon as we landed, we received advice that the Chevalier de Callière was come to supply the room of Mr. Perrault, the governor of this place. Mr. Perrault has had several scuffles with Mr. de Frontenac and Mr. de la Barre, of which you may expect a farther account when I am better informed. All the world blames our general for his bad success. 'Tis talked publicly that his only design was to cover the sending of several canoes to traffic with the savages in those lakes for beaver skins. The people here are very busy in wasting over to court 1,000 calumnies against him. Both the clergy and the gentlemen of the long robe write to his disadvantage. Though after all, the whole charge is false, for the poor man could do no more than he did. Just now I was informed that Mr. Hainaut, Mr. Montortier, and Mr. Durivan, 3 captains of ships, are arrived at Quebec with a design to pass the winter there and to assist him as counselors, and that the last of these 3 has brought with him an independent company to be commanded by himself. I shall have no opportunity of writing again before the next spring, for the last ships that are to return for France this year are now ready to sail. I am, sir, yours, etc. Letter 8, dated at Monreal, June 28, 1685, representing the fortifications of Monreal and the indiscreet zeal of the priests who are lords of that town, with a description of Chambli and of the commerce of the savages upon the Great Lakes. Sir, I have just received yours, by a small vessel of Bordeaux loaded with wine, which is the first that came to Quebec this year. I am mightily pleased to hear that the king has granted to Mr. de la Salle 4 ships to go upon the discovery of the mouth of the Mississippi, and cannot but admire your curiosity in desiring to know the occurrences of this place and how I spent my time in the winter. Mr. de Calier was no sooner possessed of his government that he ordered all the inhabitants of this town and of the adjacent country to cut down and bring in great stakes of 15 foot in length to fortify the town. During the winter, these orders were pursued with so much application that all things are now ready for making the enclosure, in which 500 or 600 men are to be employed. I spent part of the winter in hunting with the Algonkins, in order to a more perfect knowledge of their language, and the rest I spent in this place, with a great deal of uneasiness, for here we cannot enjoy ourselves, either at play or in visiting the ladies, but is presently carried to the curate's ears, who takes public notice of it in the pulpit. His zeal goes so far as even to name the persons, and since he refuses the sacrament of the Holy Supper to ladies of quality upon the most slender pretenses, you may easily guess at the other steps of his indiscretion. You cannot imagine to what a pitch these ecclesiastical lords have screwed their authority. They excommunicate all the masks, and wherever they spy 'em, they run after 'em to uncover their faces, and abuse 'em in a reproachful manner. In fine, they have a more watchful eye over the conduct of the girls and married women than their fathers and husbands have. They cry out against those that do not receive the sacrament once a month, and at Easter they oblige all sorts of persons to give in bills to their confessors. They prohibit and burn all the books that treat of any other subject but devotion. When I think of this tyranny, I cannot but be enraged at the impertinent zeal of the curate of this city. This inhumane fellow came one day to my lodging, and finding the romance of the adventures of Petronius upon my table, he fell upon it with an unimaginable fury, and tore out almost all the leaves. This book I valued more than my life, because 'twas not castrated, and indeed I was so provoked when I saw it all in rack, that if my landlord had not held me, I had gone immediately to that turbulent pastor's house, and would have plucked out the hairs of his beard with as little mercy as he did the leaves of my book. These animals cannot content themselves with the studying of men's actions, but they must likewise dive into their thoughts. By this sketch, sir, you may judge what a pleasant life we lead here. The 30th of the last March the ice melted, and the river being then open, I was sent with a small detachment to Chambli, for commonly the sun resumes its vigor here much about that time. Chambli stands on the brink of a basin, about 5 or 6 leagues off this place. That basin is 2 leagues in circumference, and receives the lake of Champlain, by a waterfall that is 1.5 leagues in length, out of which there arises a river that disembourges at Sorel into the river of St. Laurence, as I intimated above in my 4th letter. In former time, this place had a great trade in beaver skins, which is now decayed, for the Sokokis, the Mahingans, and the Openangus used formerly to resort thither in shoals, to exchange their furs for other goods, but at present they are retired to the English colonies, to avoid the pursuit of the Iroquois. The Champlain Lake, which lies above that waterfall, is 80 leagues in circumference. At the end of this lake we met with another, called S. Sacrament, by which one may go very easily to New York, there being but a land carriage of 2 leagues from thence to the river du Fer, which falls into the Manasseh. While I was at Chambly, I saw 2 canoes loaded with beaver skins pass privately by that way, and 'twas thought that they were sent thither by Mr. de la Barre. This smuggling way of trade is expressly prohibited, for they are obliged to carry these skins before the office of the company, where they are rated at 160%, less than the English buy them at their colonies. But the little fort that stands at the bottom of the waterfall, upon the brink of the basin of Chambly, being only single palisades, it cannot hinder people to pass that way, especially considering that the prospect of so great a profit renders the passengers the more daring. The inhabitants of the adjacent villages are very much exposed to the incursions of the Iroquois in time of war. Notwithstanding the weakness of the fort, I continued in that place 1.5 months, and then I returned hither, where Mr. de la Barre arrived some days after, being accompanied with Mr. Henaut, Mr. Mortortier, and Mr. Duriveau. Much about the same day there arrived 25 or 30 canoes, belonging to the coureurs de bois, being homeward bound from the Great Lakes and laden with beaver skins. The cargo of each canoe amounted to 40 packs, each of which weighs 50 pounds and will fetch 50 crowns at the farmer's office. These canoes were followed by 50 more of the Ottawas and Hurons, who come down every year to the colony, in order to make a better market than they can do in their own country of Missilimakinac, which lies on the bank of the Lake of Hurons, at the mouth of the Lake of the Illinois. Their way of trading is as follows. Upon their first arrival, they encamp at the distance of 500 or 600 paces from the town. The next day is spent in ranging their canoes, unloading their goods, and pitching their tents, which are made of birch-bark. The next day after, they demand audience of the Governor-General, which is granted them that same day in a public place. Upon this occasion, each nation makes a ring for itself. The savages sit upon the ground with their pipes in their mouths, and the governor is seated in an armed chair, after which there starts up an orator or speaker from one of these nations, who makes an harangue, importing that his brethren are come to visit the Governor-General, and to renew with him their wonted friendship, that their chief view is to promote the interest of the French, some of whom, being unacquainted with the way of traffic, and being too weak for the transporting of goods from the lakes, would be unable to deal in beaver skins, if his brethren did not come in person to deal with them in their own colonies, that they know very well how acceptable their arrival is to the inhabitants of Monreal, in regard of the advantage they reap by it, that in regard the beaver skins are much valued in France, and the French goods given in exchange are of an inconsiderable value. They mean to give the French sufficient proof of their readiness to furnish them with what they desire so earnestly, that by way of preparation for another year's cargo, they are come to take in exchange fuses, powder, and ball, in order to hunt great numbers of beavers, or to gall the Iroquois, in case they offer to disturb the French settlements. And, in fine, that in confirmation of their words, they throw a porcelain collier with some beaver skins to the Kichi Okima, so they call the Governor General, whose protection they lay claim to in case of any robbery or abuse committed upon them in the town. The spokesman, having made an end of his speech, returns to his place and takes up his pipe, and then the interpreter explains the substance of the harangue to the governor, who commonly gives a very civil answer, especially if the present be valuable, in consideration of which he likewise makes them a present of some trifling things. This done, the savages rise up and return to their huts to make suitable preparations for the ensuing truck. The next day, the savages make their slaves carry the skins to the houses of the merchants, who bargain with them for such clothes as they want. All the inhabitants of Monreal are allowed to traffic with them in any commodity but wine and brandy, these two being accepted upon the account that when the savages have got what they wanted and have any skins left, they drink to excess and they kill their slaves. For when they are in drink, they quarrel and fight, and if they were not held by those who are sober, would certainly make havoc one of another. However, you must observe that none of them will touch either gold or silver. 'Tis a comical sight to see 'em running from shop to shop, stark naked, with their bow and arrow. The nicer sort of women are wont to hold their fans before their eyes, to prevent their being frightened with the view of their ugly parts. But these merry companions, who know the brisk she-merchants as well as we, are not wanting in making an offer, which is sometimes accepted of, when the present is of good metal. If we may credit the common report, there are more than one or two of the ladies of this country whose constancy and virtue has held out against the attacks of several officers, and at the same time vouchsafed a free access to these nasty lechers. 'Tis presumed their compliance was the effect of curiosity rather than of any nice relish, for, in a word, the savages are neither brisk nor constant, but whatever is in the matter, the women are the most excusable upon this head, that such opportunities are very unfrequent. As soon as the savages have made an end of their truck, they take leave of the governor, and so return home by the river of Ottawas. To conclude, they did a great deal of good both to the poor and rich, for you will readily apprehend that everybody turns merchant upon such occasions. I am, sir, yours, etc.